Good morning, everyone. My name is Tom Musgrave from the Kentucky Arts Council, and we want to thank you for being with us for the first webinar of 2024 in the Creative Industry Summit Series. The key to well-produced print material. Just to give it a little background, the genesis of this webinar was I receive a lot of printed material in my home mailbox from either nonprofit organizations or commercial businesses, and I look at it critically often because you can tell they spent a lot of money on it because it's very nice cardstock, glossy paper, and they printed it in color. But then it's I'm critical of it because graphically it's all over the place. There's a million fonts in there. It's unreadable. And so I sort of lament to myself that they spent all this money on something that is not really not really communicating very well. And the design failed in the execution. So what we wanted to do was bring in an expert who can give you some pointers on how to produce communications pieces that'll get someone's attention. And we'll also talk about how you can work with your print shop, whether it's locally or one of the national chain print shops, to get the best possible product from your print communications pieces. So with that in mind, I want to introduce Ashley Reaves, who is a graphic designer with the Kentucky Department for Fish and Wildlife. She's a photographer also and visual storyteller known for her creative approach to attention and detail. She has more than 6 years of experience, and her areas of focus include illustration, animation, advertising, print, and digital graphic design. As a designer, she's worked with brands including the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources, Eastern Kentucky University, and 42 Lines Creative. Her ability to create designs that are not only visually stunning, but also communicate their message effectively sets her apart. In her free time, Ashley enjoys traveling, bird watching, and exploring new hiking trails. So with that, I'm going to turn this presentation over to Ashley, who's going to start giving you some helpful hints on design.
Good morning, everybody. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and we'll start the presentation.
Ashley, I'm going to jump in here. You go ahead and share. I want to remind folks, we will have a Q&A session toward the end of the webinar, but the chat is open for your questions, and somebody from the Arts Council staff will be monitoring, and we'll make sure that that you get answers.
Well, as Tom mentioned, I'm a graphic design coordinator for the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources. Today, I'm going to walk you through some principles of design as well as pre-press guidelines. My goal with this presentation is to give you all some behind-the-scenes info regarding these areas to help you better develop and print designs, as well as provide you all with some fun resources that'll help you along the way. Now, graphic design is all about communication. You and your team decide on what that message is and create designs using specific elements to connect with your viewer and reach your team's goals. Your goals could include spreading information, increase sales, or increase sales for a product or your team. Either way, understanding the elements you have at your disposal and how they come together to communicate with your audience or demographic will help you to be more successful and to create more engaging designs. With that being said, I'll start with our first graphic design element, font, or more specifically, font type. Now, each type of font communicates a different message. There's a lot that's represented visually through font choice without ever having to read a word. We'll go over 4 different groups covering aspects that identify that font type, the message that each font type conveys, and how they can better help you select type for your designs. So what is a font type?
Hey, Ashley. Right
Yes.
now we're seeing you on your screen. We're not seeing the PowerPoint. I'm not sure if that's intentional or not, so we might have to.
It's not. Let's see. Let me see if turning off my camera will help.
So
I
Laura
can,
McGee, can everybody else see the PowerPoint?
I can see the PowerPoint,
Okay.
and there's been other people in the chat who've indicated they can see the PowerPoint as
Okay.
well.
Well,
Okay.
ignore me then, because I'm getting a different view, but my view is the incorrect one. Sorry about that. Go ahead.
Okay, so we're all good? All right, so what is a font type? A font type is a set of design features for letters and characters. Examples of font types include serif, sans serif, slab serif, and script. We'll start with a serif font type. This font type is characterized by the extra stroke found at the top and bottom of its characters. This right here, this is called a script. This font style represents professionalism and readability. Now here are some examples of brands that utilize serif fonts. This font is considered more traditional or formal. You'll see that examples of brands that utilize this font type want to communicate tradition or formality in some way. Examples of brands that use this font type are government agencies, banks, magazines, newspapers, clothing, and luxury brands. Here are some examples that include the New York Times, JP Morgan, Better Homes and Gardens, and the United States government, and LL Bean. Each of these brands wants their demographic to connect their brand to tradition and formality in some way. Knowing what this font represents, it's easy to understand why a law firm like JP Morgan or a government agency would want to exude formality and tradition. Next, we'll move on to the sans serif font type. The sans serif font type is characterized by the lack of a serif. This font is known for its clarity at a distance and in small spaces. This font represents simple, clean, and modern look. Because of this, you'll see sans serif fonts used in large format printing like billboards, posters, and yard signs, as well as small format like our desktops and digital devices. You'll see that examples of brands that utilize this font type want to communicate being modern or new in some way. Examples of brands that utilize this type of font are sports teams or brands, grocery stores, libraries, theaters, and food or restaurant brands. Here are a few examples. Our examples include Pepsi, Kroger, the Texas baseball team, Lexington Public Library, and the Kentucky Performing Arts. Each of these graphics is a representation of their company from logo to billboard to flyer. Each company utilizes the sans serif font to promote that they are or have the latest and greatest, whether that's a process, product, or experience. We'll move on to slab serif font type. This font type is characterized by the thick block-like serifs. Yet again, these are our serifs at the top and bottom of its characters. Slab serif fonts tend to evoke a vintage charm and can walk the line between traditional and modern. Their bold and attention-grabbing appearance makes them the ideal for header and subheaders. Slab serifs can be harder to read due to their size and weight and lack of contrast, and as such should not be used for paragraphs of text. Usually brands that utilize this font type want to convey that they are vintage in some way or are bridging the gap between traditional and modern. Examples of brands that utilize this type of font are universities, sports teams, movie theaters, and food or restaurant brands. Here are a few examples. Our examples include the University of Kentucky, the Kansas City Chiefs, Blue Peter Export Beer, movie theaters, and Burger King. So if we take a look at Blue Peter specifically, Blue Peter is connecting their modern demographic to a history of the brewing process. UK pairs their vintage slab serif logo as a reminder of their long and successful history and a connection to past memories of alumni, with a serif font alluding to the professionalism that's expected from a university. This movie theater graphic nods to the historic process of film, even including a vintage film movie projector. Now, our last font type is the script font type. This font type is a font that mimics cursive handwriting or calligraphy. Script fonts are usually used as a way to include style, sophistication, or a more personal touch or authenticity to a design. Our examples include Kellogg's, Michael's, Purple Toad Winery, Cadillac, and Instagram. Keeping in mind that a script font represents style, sophistication, personal touch, or authenticity, why would a primarily parent and child-focused brand want to use a script font for their logo like Kellogg's? Their goal is to create cereal or other food products. They use a script font to evoke authenticity into their brand. They want their demographic to associate their food with being homemade and of good quality, like a handwritten recipe from a family member. I'll use Kellogg's as an example of font combinations. Now that we have an idea of what each font type represents, we'll look at how they combine font types to communicate their message. In this design, we have the Kellogg's logo continuing to evoke personal, homemade, trustworthy brand paired with an italicized sans serif font. The italicized font represents movement or energy, which in theory, the cereal would give you. The sans serif font is large and easy to read by younger and older viewers and evokes the modern technology used to produce a cereal they market as giving you enough energy to not only get through your day, but be great. Now we'll go through some resources. This is the fun part. So, let's see. Here we are. So our first resource is Adobe Font. This is, if you have an Adobe subscription, this is a great resource. So they have trending now and new release fonts, which are fun to go through if you need some inspiration. They also have some font packs. This is great if you're interested in something specific, but you don't really have a direction you want to go, whether it's posters or wedding design, retro, letters that tell stories. All of these are really beneficial. They also have this all fonts section that's phenomenal. Through this section, you can narrow down what type of font you'd like. So let's say you want a script font. You can click this script section and all of these will populate. They also have a sample text section. So if we type in a word here, it'll show you what the example is in that font type and font family. And if you click on the font itself, it shows you the entire font family. And if you're lucky, sometimes this one doesn't, but some of them will show you other font combinations that would go well with that. So if you have a script and it has a font combination, maybe it'll show you a sans serif for some of those good combinations in a design as a whole instead of just a header. Our next example and reference is Creative Market. This is a wonderful place to come to download and purchase fonts and anything else you would really need, illustrations. You do purchase licensing for this, but they do have a free section, so we'll go to that today. Our free downloads. So for this month, if you have an account with them, which the account is free, it's just purchasing the elements that costs. You can go through here and you can click on Cortez. This font would be free to download. You will need to check licensing for all of these. So I believe for these, it's personal use, but you can buy a commercial license. See, our next font resources is DaFont. This is a great place to come and just download fun fonts. If you don't have an Adobe subscription, if you don't have the money in your budget for that cost, this is a good place to come, although most of these are personal use. We'll click on this one as an example. So we see the note at the top, this is for personal use, so you'll check the licensing per font that you look at. And our last one is Font Squirrel. Now these are licensed for commercial work, so that's wonderful. You will still want to check the licensing for each individual font. We'll click this one as an example. So this is the fonts that you'll be downloading. This is their font family. And then this just shows you some of their information and you can check on the licensing here. So with that, we'll move on to color. Now we're going to start with color theory. Now, color theory could be its own presentation. I'm going to go over a few types of color combinations and perceptions of a few colors. Every color has its own perception. If this is something you're interested in, I encourage you to research this further. With each type of color combination, I've pulled a design that showcases that style as an example of what this would look like. We're going to start with color perception. Please keep in mind that different tints and shades of a color represent different things. Shades and tints refer to adding white or black to a color. A shade is adding black and a tint is adding white. So what is color theory? Color theory is the study of how color works together and how they affect our emotions and perceptions. Understanding color theory allows a designer to select colors that go well together and convey the correct message. We are going to start with the color blue. This color is the most used color in logo and brand design. As we understand how humans perceive blue, it's easy to understand why companies would want to utilize blue in their branding. So what does blue represent? The color blue is perceived in a variety of ways. The top associations with this color are calm, peace, trust, loyalty, depth, sadness, and authenticity. The color blue is known to decrease heart rate, lower blood pressure, and reduce anxiety. A study out of Thailand analyzed the effects of color in the workplace and found that people are more productive and creative when working in blue rooms. Understanding how humans perceive and react to color can help you convey your desired message in a more effective way. For example, you may now notice that a great deal of banks utilize the color blue in hopes of consumers perceiving them as trustworthy, calm, and authentic. Our next color that we'll discuss is the color orange. The color orange is associated with energy, positivity, warmth, adventure, creativity, and warning. It's important to remember that colors have different meanings for different cultures. While the color orange may be associated with warning here in the United States, for example, signs that alert us to dangerous or hazardous conditions, in Asia, the color has a strong connection to religion and spirituality. And in the Middle East, the color orange is associated with mourning and loss. To keep this presentation brief, I'll move on to color combinations, but truly, if this is something that you're interested in, I recommend you dig deeper into color theory. Now, your message or goal can help you narrow down what colors you'd like to communicate with your target audience. From there, color combinations can be a good place to draw inspiration. We'll go through a few examples now, and then I'll provide some resources that may help you with your own designs. Our first color combination is monochromatic. Let's back out of the way. Now, monochromatic is selecting one hue and creating contrast by using different shades or tints of that same color. So this Rain Parade poster does a really great job of utilizing the color blue in different shades and tints. Our next color combination is analogous. There we go. Now, analogous is selecting three colors next to each other on the color wheel. For example, this poster from Portugal that uses light blue, dark blue, and green to provide interest and contrast to their design. Our final color combination today is complementary. Now, complementary colors are selecting colors opposite of one another on the color wheel. This Growlers poster uses blue and orange to draw a viewer's attention and create contrast and movement, drawing the viewer's eye down the page. Now, the fun part, our resources. There are some really wonderful color resources. We'll start with Adobe yet again. So this is if you have an Adobe subscription. This one is really wonderful because you can go through these sections and select, maybe you want analogous. It'll pull these for you. You can adjust them to whatever colors you're deciding, and it provides the hex code and the RGB build for you, which is wonderful. Our next resource is coolers. This one is just, maybe you don't have an idea at all and you just want some inspiration. You can start their generator and you just hit your space bar and it'll develop another color palette for you, and it provides the hex code as well. So that's a good resource. And our final color palette inspiration resource is Color Hunt. This one's really nice too. They provide hex codes as well. And you can see on this page that they have some examples, but you can also come down here and say, maybe you really want something inspired by the sunset, and it'll populate all of these palettes for you and give you the hex codes. They've also got, maybe you want something inspired by food. They've got some really great palette options for you here, and it can be a good place to get some inspiration. So now we'll move on to hierarchy. Now, visual hierarchy, what is that? Visual hierarchy in graphic design refers to how elements are arranged or treated on a page or screen, and is used to guide the viewer's eyes to specific information in order of importance. To show the idea of hierarchy, I've pulled some good and bad examples, and we'll talk through what makes these designs effective in communication and communicating their message or not. Our first example is this Cosmo Girl magazine. Now, on this page, according to hierarchy, the most important information is the title of the magazine and the woman in the photo, and that's not a bad place to start. Designers use multiple tools to draw the viewer's eye around the page. Some examples include shapes, contrasting colors, font size, and font orientation. They've gone a little overboard, and it's hard to figure out what part of their message we should be most interested in. We don't want to make it harder for our viewers to understand our message. It's okay to use a few different elements to create hierarchy in your design, for example, 2 fonts and a color. But using this many fonts, which we know are all representing their own message, along with color and shapes and orientation, can be overwhelming to a reader that you're hoping to connect with. Now, our Vogue magazine starts with the same idea as the other example. The most important pieces of information on this cover are the woman and the magazine title. Vogue, however, limits the elements they use to draw the viewer's eye around the page. They use one font type outside of their logo at various sizes with 2 colors, white and black, to draw the eye to each piece of information. None of the copy is fighting for attention or space, and this allows the reader to better read and connect with the information on the page. Let's go to our next example. Our next example is the citrus fair flyer. This example uses illustration, fonts, and colors to draw the viewer's eye across the page. They use multiple illustration styles along with over 7 different types of fonts and a variety of colors. When it comes to figuring out more about this event, the reader's eye may skip along the page as they attempt to discern what information is important to them if they don't disregard the poster as a whole. Now, in contrast, this Brown Folk Festival poster also uses illustration, font, and color to draw the viewer's eye across the page. This poster uses the same illustration style throughout, giving the design a cohesive look as well as limiting the colors and fonts used to help draw the reader through the information. They also utilize size in a way that draws the viewer's eye down the page and encourages the potential reader to view all of the information instead of skipping around the page. When it comes to hierarchy in design and elements of design, most of the time, less is more. Now we'll move on to an often overlooked graphic design principle, which is white space. What is white space? White space is the portion of the page that is left unmarked. It's also referred to as negative space. So for our examples, we'll start with IKEA and FedEx. IKEA, known for their modern, simple Swedish brand, does a great job of utilizing white space and drawing attention to their message in a funny and simple way. Some brands have even utilized white space to convey additional meaning in their message. A great example of this is the FedEx logo. They've used the white space between the E and the X right here to create an arrow, not only drawing the viewer's eye down the logo, but also connecting to their brand and their service. Our next examples are Land Rover and Toblerone. This Land Rover ad uses white space to allow the viewer's eyes to land on the most important, or what the brand views as the most important thing, which would be their car. Due to the white space, there is limited information for the viewer to absorb. After the car, the readers may have their eyes drawn to the logo or the text here at the top left. They may then notice the large estate in the background, and then finally the fine print at the bottom. By limiting what the audience is absorbing, they have focused our attention in a way that feels natural and easy to absorb. Similarly to FedEx, Toblerone has used white space in their logo to offer additional meaning. You may notice the bear in this white space. Our bear is right here. The bear pays homage to the city of Bern, also known as the City of Bears, where Toblerone chocolate was initially created. Now, our final section for our graphic design principles portion of the presentation is movement. Movement and design is used to guide a viewer's eye through a predetermined path in a composition. Movement can be achieved by using color, focal points, contrast, alignment, repetition, and more. Our first examples of movement are from the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife Resources State Wildlife Action Plan, or SWAP for short. This plan contains a lot of technical information that we want a reader to understand as easily as possible. Due to this, we utilize the color for each taxa and draw the viewer's eye down the page. We also use repeating patterns in the layout of the design with text on the right and photos on the left. This allows readers to anticipate from section to section how the information will be presented and absorb the content more effectively. Our next example is the Sherlock Holmes poster. This poster uses repetition in the clouds here, from the title at the top of the page to the illustration at the bottom. In using this movement, they connect the piece as a whole and guide the viewer to all of the information. Without this element, the design may feel choppy as the viewer fights between processing the title and the illustration. Our final example is this railbird poster. This railbird poster uses color, contrast, repetition, and shape to move the eye through the page, as we can see in the repeating of the dealing with our type here, the font choices, and the colors that they've chosen for each. Now, this marks the end of our journey through the graphic design principles and how they relate to our goals and our audience. I hope you'll be able to recognize and use some of these elements to provide to use and improve in your designs in the future. I'll turn it over now to Tom to get ready to discuss pre-press processes.
All right, thank you, Ashley. I hope that that all the participants today have been able to glean some principles of graphic design that you can use within your organization or your personal business. And again, we'll be taking questions toward the end of the webinar, and of course throughout if you want to use the chat to ask questions, someone from the Arts Council staff will be monitoring that. So now you've learned these principles of graphic design, you've applied them to a communications piece. The next step is to get it printed. So Ashley is going to next talk about some things you can do before you even send the file to your printer to make sure that that you're going to get the best possible product in return, and also some questions to ask someone that print shop that you're going to be working with, and basic things to do again to get the best possible product back. So I'm going to turn it back over to Ashley.
Now, these tips and these concepts are going to make you your print shop's best friend. That's the goal for this, is to make it easy for you, to make it easy for them, and to get the best work possible for you. So we'll start with color builds. Now, one of the very first things that you decide to do before you start a design is to choose whether a design will be digital or printed. This decision will decide what color build you need to be working with to receive the best possible quality. So what are color builds? There are three major types of color builds that we'll consider when creating a design. The three color builds are CMYK for print, RGB for digital, and Pantone for print. We'll start with CMYK. CMYK stands for cyan, magenta, yellow, and black. These are the colors that a printer uses to produce a design. You may have also heard of this called a four-color build. So for example, this teal color in CMYK is built by combining 87% cyan, 31% magenta, 69% yellow, and 15% black. Similar to CMYK, RGB is an acronym for the colors used to build on a digital screen using light. Any color you see digitally is built from red, green, and blue on a scale from 0 to 255. For example, this teal color in RGB is built by combining 8 red, 120 green, and 97 blue. I've also provided the hex code for this color right here. Now, hex codes tell the display on your screen what color to show. The display reads the information about how to make the color from the code and creates it from red, green, and blue. I've heard hex codes also described as a recipe that the computer uses to build your color. So our last color build is Pantone. Pantone Matching System, or PMS, is a standardized color system that identifies almost 5,000 various color shades and variations that are pre-mixed. This number system allows designers and print manufacturers to match colors correctly. Pantones are identified by the numbers assigned to them. For example, our swatch here. The Pantone color for this swatch is Pantone 349C. The letter after the number of the Pantone lets the printer know what type of paper the color will be printed on. So coated paper, for example, is denoted by the letter C. The letter M denotes matte paper, and uncoated paper is represented by the letter U. A common problem with when printers receive a design meant to be printed, it's built in RGB instead of CMYK. Because of the different ways the colors are built via ink or light, this can result in a printed design that doesn't match what the client intended. For example, darker colors built with RGB will appear on a screen as dark green or dark red, but when printed with the CMYK process, they'll turn out black. This also goes for photography as well. Most photography, as it's taken on a digital device, is started in RGB format. So before you edit a picture and send it to print, it's best to switch the color mode of the photo to CMYK and then edit the image or use the photo in your design. And I'll show you how to do that in Photoshop. So this is a screenshot of one of the photos that I've taken. And in Photoshop, all you do is go up to image, you'll select mode, and then you'll select what you need here. So if you want it to remain digital, you can leave it at RGB, but you can see that I've selected CMYK here. Our next piece to consider before printing a design is the resolution. Now, the resolution of the design or image refers to the detail of an image. For digital design, it's referred to as pixels per inch or PPI, and for print, it's referred to as dots per inch or DPI. Most digital designs are made with between 72 and 150 PPI. This allows the image to appear clear at the decided dimension on a screen. However, if an image with 72 PPI is printed at the same size, the image will appear blurry. There isn't enough detail present for the printer to make the image appear crisp. Now for printed designs or images, we recommend 300 DPI or higher. The reason that these images aren't used digitally is because it would slow down the load time of your page, or it would increase the space that's needed to store that file. Let's see. You may also hear resolution referred to as pixel density. And before you start a project, please be sure the resolution of the design matches your end goal for the piece. So if the goal for the piece is to be printed, you want to set up that file to begin with before you've done anything at 300 PPI or DPI. Now here's an example of what that would look like on an Adobe Illustrator file. So you would start the file, you would start it with print. We have our dimensions here. And then you can see our color mode is selected for CMYK for print. And right here, we have our resolution set to 300 PPI. So before you send a file to print, another thing to consider are printer marks. But before I get to that, I'm going to talk about printing an image. So how do you know that a picture that you have that is high resolution, what size that can be printed? So there's a mathematical equation that we use to figure out what size you can print high quality image. So we divide the image's dimensions in pixels by the image's pixel density or resolution. So for example, we have an image that's 300 PPI with a width of 3,600 pixels and a height of 4,800 pixels. So we would divide the height, 3,600 pixels, by the resolution, which is 300, and that gives you 12 inches. And for the height, we have 4,800 pixels, and the resolution would also be 300, and you would get 16 inches. So this image wouldn't be able to be printed any larger than 12 by 16 at 300 pixels per inch. Any larger than that, and you'll start to lose your resolution. So now we'll discuss printer marks. So printer marks are a guide for the printing vendor. They aren't marks seen in the final product, but instead help to ensure your design is produced in a way that you intend. Common printer marks or references include crop marks, bleed marks, and a safety zone. The crop mark shows the vendor where they'll cut the paper during the trimming process. A bleed mark is used to extend the color to the edge of the page by extending the design beyond the crop or trim mark. Without using bleed and including bleed marks in your design, you may have your design cut in a way that shows the plain paper or white underneath. So if you've ever sent something to print and you've gotten it back and it's got a white edge on one side, it's because the bleed marks weren't correct. Now, in this example that I've provided, the pink line here shows the crop lines. This is where the paper will be cut. The green line shows the bleed line, and the crop and bleed marks for the printer are these lines right here. So your design, when you export it, won't have these. These are something that I provided just for digital reference. This is what will be provided to your printer. Now I pulled another example from Vistaprint. For this example, inside the dash line here is the safety area. So this whole section is our safety area. The crop area where they'll trim the paper is our blue line, and the last gray dark line is our bleed line. Bleed can be set up when a document is created, and here is an example of what that would look like on an Adobe InDesign screen. So you've got it set to print, you've got your dimensions, and down here you'll see your margins, and then underneath that you'll see bleed and slug. So I have it set to 0.125 or 1/8 of an inch. Now, 1/8 of an inch or 0.125 is a common size for bleed, although your vendor will have more information on how much bleed they prefer per project. So another common practice before sending a file to print is to outline your fonts. This is used if you're sending your vendor a native file, for example, an InDesign or an Illustrator file. If your vendor requires a native file and your fonts aren't outlined, their computer will fill in your font with a generic font. To prevent this from happening, we outline the font and create a vector graphic. This prevents any issues with access to fonts. An example of this would be sending a postcard to a vendor with a section of variable data that they're going to put a mailing list in for you. If you use the font Helvetica and the vendor doesn't have access to the font and you haven't outlined it, the computer will fill in the font with another generic type, altering your design. You won't receive what you're looking for. Now, to outline a font in InDesign, you would select the font that you're hoping to outline. So I've selected Explore More here. You'll go up to the Type tab, you'll come down here and you'll either click Create Outlines. I'd also like to mention that vendors may request a packaged file to print a design. A packaged file is a native file, so the InDesign or Illustrator file, a PDF, and then links to any graphics or illustrations and fonts used. Not all fonts will appear in a packaged file. For example, if you have an Adobe subscription, those fonts won't be packaged. So to work around this, you either have to outline the font or the vendor has to have an Adobe subscription to access what you have. So we just avoid that whole thing and outline it for them so that they don't have to send it back to us, and then we have to either provide the font file or outline it and then send it again. Now, if you're sending a PDF that doesn't need any altering, you can leave your fonts as is. Our next section is printing line work. Not everybody does line work, but it's still something that if it's something that you'd like to have in your design repertoire, this is some good information to know. And line work can be kind of tricky. So there are a few things that will make printing easier for you and for your vendor. The first is expanding your line work, especially if your design may be increased or decreased in size. For larger designs especially, we'll make vector graphics at half the size. So if you're making a billboard or if you're making a large sign, you don't make it at that sign size, you usually make it about half the size, and then the vendor will up that size for you to the correct final version. If your lines aren't outlined and your design is scaled up to the point size that you have set for your line originally will look considerably smaller because it'll stay the same. It's not increasing with scale, it's staying at the initial that you selected if you haven't outlined. Now, to do this in Adobe Illustrator, you'll select the lines or shapes. So I've come over here and this is a stroke, so I've selected that. And then I've gone up to Object, and then you click Expand. And if it's an object that has an outline on the outside, you'd go to Expand Appearance, and then you would select Stroke and Fill. So this example shows an expanded line on the top row and how the thickness of the line adjusts the scale of the graphic. This bottom line shows a line that hasn't been expanded and how it would appear to remain the same regardless of scale. Another thing to keep in mind when printing line work is whether or not your line work will be on a colored background. Darker colors tend to bleed into the design and can make your line appear smaller than intended or disappear completely. This goes for text as well. In general, it's recommended that type be medium thickness or above to prevent the bleeding from happening and for that text to become illegible to keep it remaining readable. This is something you can check on your own if you have a standard printer at home. Doing a test print will allow you to make any changes needed on the text or line work, and it may save you money as well, as some printers and vendors charge more for additional proofs. Now, all three of these examples, I would do a test print on before sending to a vendor. Now, this first invitation is lovely. I have a feeling that the line work and the text would actually be fine, but these little stars here in our background, they may be completely lost if the ink bleeds into them. It's better to check ahead of time on your own than have to go back and forth with multiple proofs from your vendor. Our second poster, it looks wonderful for the most part. The only thing that really concerns me is the address right here, which is pretty vital information. It may be totally fine, but it's worth checking on your own instead of ordering and then not being happy with your final product. This last business card example is really pushing it when it comes to line work. If this is what the design looks like on your screen, if this is a mock-up and not a picture of the final version, when this is printed, it's going to lose not only this outline right here, but it's going to lose the word consulting here at the bottom. Now, my last section is kind of just questions to ask your printer. Maybe you're not familiar with your printer, or you're thinking about using a different printer. These are some good questions to get you started and to kind of give you an idea of what your printer can handle and how they would like their files set up. So our first question is, what type of paper options do you offer? Some vendors may have paper sample packs that they'll send you for a small charge or for free. You would be surprised at the number of different types of paper available. From pearlescent paper to linen, there's a huge variety, and understanding what your printer provides can help you choose a vendor. You may want to ask about the stock or thickness of the paper. They may have cardstock, but that doesn't mean that they have the stock or thickness that you're hoping for your design. Also understanding that depending on the quantity, your vendor may not have this paper in their shop, but they can source it. If that's the case, your order may take longer to process, which is important to know if you have a tight deadline. Our next question is, what kind of finishes do you offer? Different types of finishes can include things like lamination, foil stamping, holographic foils, perforation, metallic inks, and spot UV. All of those, if you're really interested in doing foil type and you want your type to appear gold and metallic, and they don't have that option, then that printer's not for you, but there are other printers that do have those processes. So it's good to know beforehand. Our next question is there a minimum that they have to run for a product or a project? Before placing an order, it's good to check their minimums for orders. If you only want 15 postcards, but their minimum is 100, that may mean that you don't go with that vendor and you select someone else. Now, our next question is, how much bleed would you prefer for a project? This is really up to your vendor and their trimming process. Generally, the larger the product or project, the larger that they will ask the bleed to be, but it's good to check with your vendor specifically. This will make their job 10 times easier and will increase the likelihood of you getting a product that you're happy with. This last question, I guess it's not the last, but our second to last question is, what size should be used for a piece? This is especially important for mailed pieces or designs with a fold. Mail pieces have strict areas that must be left blank for the post office, and the regulations can change, and they change often. Your print shop should know the latest regulations for mailed pieces and either tell you how much room you have to leave or provide you with a template. If they don't, this information can be found on USPS, but it's kind of hard to find. Now, designs with a fold must have a specific amount of room added to each panel of the design so that the piece folds correctly. Your vendor will either let you know how much room to add or provide a template that shows you where the fold should be. And our final question is, do you have any artwork recommendations? This is just bare minimum. This will make their life easier, and this is probably a lot of the information that you'll need from a vendor. They'll usually let you know what they require for that piece to be printed to the best of their ability. So they'll mention things like resolution, which we've talked about, color build, what file type they need, crop and bleed marks that they prefer, and knowing this before the get-go will make it easier for you and your vendor. Once you have your answers for these questions, you'll need to consider cost, quality, speed, and service to see what printer works best for you. Now, my last slide is talking about some resources for you all. Let's see. So our first resource is Vistaprint. They have a free business sample kit, as well as a free business card sample kit and free wedding sample kit. Now, you don't get to pick the design that is on these. Usually they send these with their own branding or some sample branding, but it includes a lot of information and text and paper types, especially if you pick, let's go to the wedding sample kit. So with this one, you get a variety of paper shapes, stocks, and colors. I know they include their pearlescent paper, which is nice to see in person, and I believe they also include their linen paper, which is nice to see. They also include things like foil. This save the date right here is actually a gold metallic, so seeing that in person and what that will look like for your design can be really beneficial. Our next resource is Moo. This is one of my favorites. They are a little bit on the pricier side, but their quality is unmatched. They're wonderful. And they also have this product sample pack that will provide you with really everything you need to know about their brand, different types of paper, gloss, premium, pearlescent, cotton, linen. They'll even send you some of their rounded edge options so that you can see what that would look like if you're interested in that for business cards or postcards. It's really beneficial to see what their work is like before you spend all this money to have it ordered and printed. Our final resource is for USPS and finding a printer local to you. This is especially handy if you're doing something with direct mail. All of these vendors, and this won't be all of the vendors in your area, but this is the vendors that your post office recommends for your area that they work with. So I'll type in Frankfurt. And it shows us these two that have direct mail capabilities. So instead of going through Google and trying to find what the best options for you for direct mail would be, this is a really great resource. With that's kind of it for me. That's the last resource that I had, and that's the end of my presentation. So I'll go ahead and stop sharing, and if we have any questions, we can get into those.
Yeah, thank you, Ashley. I have some questions I may ask, but we do have one in the chat. And it relates to Canva, which I think a lot of nonprofit organizations are taking advantage of, either in its free version or professional subscription version. So the question is, Canva offers some of these resources and support for color build / printer marks, but have you heard any concerns from printers about Canva? Asking especially because I've been at multiple nonprofits where we did not have Adobe subscriptions.
Gotcha. So Canva is a great resource. I have had some experience. Eastern Kentucky University used Canva for some additional printing resources for the university as a whole. When we couldn't take on that work, it was they were given access to our Canva subscription for the university, and they could print things and produce things. It's really best to have a good relationship with your printer or your vendor. So when you get those files and it provides the crops and bleed marks, sending it to them and asking to see a proof just to be sure that you're not getting some of those weird things like edges. When you work through Canva, fonts tend to be wonderful. Colors tend to be fine. Illustrations tend to print fine. It's just your crops and bleed marks can get a little funky. So if you have a good relationship with your printer and can ask those questions before production, Canva is a good resource.
All right, thank you. Next question in the chat is, for many of my organization's larger print design projects, we don't know who our printer / vendor will be until we can provide a completed design file and have the project bid out. That's a common thing. That's a common thing for government agencies to have to do. Is there a standard bleed / crop to start out with when beginning a design? And if not, how should I go about adding or editing those specs after a design is completed?
Gotcha. So off the bat, if I know something's going to be printed, I go ahead and give it that 1/8 of an inch bleed if I think my design is going to have bleed. The things that tend to have a little bit higher bleed would be like a big banner that you're going to have printed and included at a stadium. That sort of thing may kind of bump it up to 1/4 inch. So if you're really concerned and you really don't want to have to go back and edit your file, you can go ahead and start it at 1/4. And then if your vendor asks for only an 1/8, you can go into InDesign, into your document settings and adjust your bleed down. So then your work is already to the edge. You don't have to worry about increasing an illustration to fill in that space. It's already filled in that area and it's just cropping it in a little bit tighter for you.
All right, thank you. This next question is, it looks like it's for the Arts Council in general, so I'll field this one, Ashley. What print materials, business card, postcard, brochure, do you recommend that we bring to Kentucky Crafted Market to help connect with wholesalers and retail customers? My initial my suggestion would be certainly a business card, and something that has your website address and email address on it, um, and a postcard, a brochure, because people are not going to be hanging out forever at your booth. They're going to be walking around looking at all the booths. If they have a postcard that they can look that has a sample or a couple of samples of your work, and maybe on the back a QR code that goes to your website, that's something that they can take with them, tuck it in their shopping bag relatively quickly. So I hope that answers that question. Ashley, I was going to ask, since Canva came up and the reality that sometimes organizations and even individuals maybe can't afford the Adobe Creative Suite. If somebody was interested in the Adobe Creative Suite but just wanted to kind of dip their toe, what are some bare bones minimal applications that you think people should, on a budget, should subscribe to in the Adobe Creative Suite?
So I think that really depends on what your business or personal interest is. So if you're primarily an artist and your specialization is photography, I would say Photoshop and Lightroom. If you're really interested in illustration and digital art, I would say Illustrator all the way, and then maybe Photoshop. If you're creating marketing material for a brand and you're worried about doing posters and flyers and brochures and postcards, I would get InDesign. It really just depends on what your goal is and then what resources Adobe has available. Adobe Font, I believe, is included in a lot of their other subscriptions. So like if you get InDesign, I believe you also get Adobe Font. So that would be put together.
Okay. I'd like to, let's see. Oh, we have a question in the chat. What are your opinions on Adobe Express? I assume that means Adobe Photoshop Express.
Really, I haven't had, so Adobe Fresco and Adobe Express, I haven't had as much experience as I have the desktop versions, but when it comes to working on an iPad, if I'm traveling, I think those are wonderful. But if I have the option, I would rather have the desktop full versions than the Express versions.
Okay. I have a question that I'd like to ask about photos. There have been times where people will go on a website and they'll do a right click on a photo and save as, and then they know that it's low res because it's coming off the web, but then they'll go into Photoshop or some other photo editing software and increase the DPI to 300 for print. Why is this a bad idea, and what is the way to avoid that, or to work around that?
Right. So when we talk about resolution, so like Tom mentioned, when you pull an image from a website, it's already tailored to the website. So the most you're going to get is 150 pixels per inch. You're probably getting 72. That's the standard. When you pull that 72 PPI image and put it into Photoshop and then increase your resolution, instead of it, instead of a normal image where it has that information, it'll either scale it up or down. It's filling in that information with pixels that it thinks is doing a good job, but generally it doesn't really know what it's filling in. It doesn't have that information it needs to do that. So for the most part, and I should mention licensing as well. If you're pulling something from a website and it's not teaching or it doesn't specifically say that this is good to be used for commercial or whatever it is you're using, I would go to pages like Unsplash and Pexels are really great resources for free images that are high resolution and high quality, and you can choose to donate what you would like for commercial use, or you can purchase commercial use images. If you have an Adobe subscription, Adobe also has Adobe Stock that you can go to. And as long as you have an account with them, period, you can go to their free section and download things. And some of that can be used commercially, some of it can't be. So you really need to look at the licensing to figure out whether you should be using this image in the first place, or whether you need to go find a resource that fits your budget and is free for use commercially or otherwise.
All right, Ashley, we have a question in the chat about business cards that I think you can field in general. I think they might be asking in relation to an event that we have coming up, Kentucky Crafted Market. The question is, there are so many formats and designs for business cards these days. Could you mention some of the most desirable features? Square versus rectangular, white versus color, photo of the artist on it, QR code, photo of the art, etc.
Gotcha. So
Realize we're dealing with not a whole lot of real estate there.
yeah, when it comes to business cards, my favorites are actually, and I'm a designer, so this comes from a background of knowing different paper quality and different materials. My favorites have been metal business cards. They're way more expensive, but I've even had some that will be bottle openers and other things. Something that gives your audience this sense of wonder when you're looking at it. When it comes to normal business cards, shapes that will fit in a wallet by far, because when you're handing it to them, they're either going to dump it in their purse or they're going to put it in their wallet. And if it's an awkward shape and it doesn't fit, it's probably getting trashed. When it comes to including a photo of the artist, I usually stray away from that because there will be some people that look at that photo and decide they may or may not like you just based on the way that you look, and you're kind of limiting yourself in that regard. When it comes to showing your artwork, I think it's always fun or nice to pull maybe not an entire piece. Like if you have a painting and there's a texture in it that you really love, making that the texture of your business card so that it's connected to you, but it's maybe not an entire piece taking up that small of a space. When it comes to black and white, I feel like that's generally personal preference and cost. Getting a business card that's printed front and back is also a cost. Having it bleed to the edge is a cost. So it really depends. If you can afford to do some things like foil or UV spot, and UV spot is like a matte background and it'll have a glossy top so that like maybe your logo stands out. A lot of that will catch people's eyes and they'll be more likely to hold on to it. I think in general, if you can afford to save up and do something a little special for your card, people are more likely to keep it and use it in the future.
All right, thank you. We have another question in the chat related to the Save for Web feature in Photoshop, I believe. This question is, I save for web for all my website photos, 600 pixels wide. Is this the best way to make sure they load fast?
That's not a bad size. When it comes to graphics in general, as long as the resolution isn't 300 and higher, The resolution in the file is actually what's gonna increase your file size. Changing something from 600 by 600 to 1,000 by 1,000 really doesn't make that much of a difference when it comes to loading on a page. So you're pretty good there. It's really more about resolution. I will say digitally, I tend to have more luck at exporting things at 150 pixels per inch, especially if you've got a really nice illustration and you export it at 600 by 600 at 72 and you upload it and it just looks a little blurry. If you export it at 150 and you can afford to have that extra amount of storage on the file, it'll clear up any resolution images and it won't really slow down the loading of your page.
And that, for me, it begs the question, when we're uploading photos, maybe not to our websites, you might have to do save for web when you're uploading it to your personal website.
Mhm.
But when you're uploading to a social media platform like Twitter or Facebook or Instagram, you're taking a 300 DPI image and uploading it to one of those social media platforms. Do those platforms automatically compress the size down to web, or is that something that's best saved for web in Photoshop or another photo editing application beforehand?
So they will not compress it down. You'll actually, if you're doing something that's a high enough resolution or a really detailed illustration or a piece of art and you go to upload that to Instagram or Facebook, sometimes you will hit a limit. They have a limit on how big that file size can be to upload it via Instagram or Facebook. Truly, I would go in and if you have the time, I mean, any picture you take on your phone is going to be fine. Any picture that you take on a camera, a lot of the time you can set it to have a RAW and a JPEG image. That JPEG image is what I would put on social media or the website, and I would save that RAW image for myself for photo editing. That's the one that's got the big file size. It's got a lot of depth to it, and that one you can really edit. And then from that file, once I'm done editing, I would export as a JPEG or PNG.
Okay. Since you brought it up, photo file type, what are the best for print? You mentioned JPEG's good for web, obviously. What are the best for print? What are some to avoid for print?
Gotcha. So best for digital, I would say JPEG and PNG. Best for print, I would say EPS or PDF. EPS, though, you have to be careful. If you're sending it to a vendor or, and maybe not even necessarily a vendor, most vendors won't take your work and use it somewhere else. But if you're sending it to someone else, then they have a file that can open up an EPS file. They'll have your artwork. So you just need to be a little careful when it comes to sending a native or an EPS file. Just so that you're comfortable with what you're putting out there and with what other people have of your artwork and information. I know at EKU we struggled a lot with this. People would ask for high quality, even just PDFs, and they would crop things and then put them in other designs. So it's just being aware of that from the get-go, and maybe just sending a PDF instead of an EPS is probably the best way to go.
All righty, thank you. I want to ask about fonts. This is going way back to the beginning of your presentation, and you mentioned the four kind of font types. There are a lot of fonts out there, like a million. And some of them come preloaded with whatever application you've purchased, and I wish they wouldn't. But what are some fonts absolutely to avoid using simply for taste and or readability?
Gotcha. So some examples of some fonts to truly avoid. I mean, if you're a teacher and you're making a flyer for your students, have at it, you know, do what sparks joy for you. But if you're making things for yourself or for a brand, I would avoid things like Comic Sans or Papyrus is another one that I'm not sure if you all have seen the SNL skit, but it's one to really avoid. Wingdings or anything that really affects legibility or readability, I would avoid. If it has a texture or if it's got if it's a script and it's got a bunch of extra flourishes, and when you type a word, you're like on the fence on whether or not to use it, don't use it. Just pick something else. There, like we said, there are a lot of font options and there are a lot of places to look for others, and I'm sure you can find a better font than the one that you're on the fence about.
I have seen one that is basically it's logs tied together to form letters, and I get what the creator was going for, but the bigger you make it, the less it looks
Oh
worse.
gosh.
That's I think that's something to consider, and that's why I asked the question. I think there are too many out there, and um, so uh, what are some a lot of organizations, and there are some representatives from organizations participating today, will produce a newsletter that's either internal or it's going out to their membership. What are some basic principles of newsletter design that you think we should follow when putting out publications like that?
Gotcha. So when it comes to content, I think the thing that I see most frequently is an overabundance of content. I think less is more when it comes to those. It's easy to keep putting information on a page and thinking that maybe they'll take the time to read it. But like the white space examples that we went through and the hierarchy examples that we went through, when it comes to that amount of information, you actually lose interest. People are more likely to delete that or walk right past it and not pay any attention if it's hard to understand. So I would really condense down your information to what is absolutely necessary. Maybe instead of talking about all of the wonderful things that you do on social media, just include a link to your social media and they can check that out if they're interested. There are a lot of things that you can do in design to kind of simplify things down, but I think really hitting your message over the head and really nailing what it is you want to say instead of, I want to say this thing, but oh, we also do this and I'd like to include that, or oh, I'd also like to mention this thing. Really narrowing down and focusing on what your goal is and including only that most important information, I think is the most beneficial.
Thank you. And just a reminder, if you have questions, do feel free to put them in the chat. We will get to them. Some of you've done that already, and we thank you for your questions. You mentioned before, I want to get into this. It's kind of a business question, but it also goes to intellectual property. You mentioned font licensing before. What is that, and why is it important for people to consider?
Gotcha. So I think of font licensing like a contract between you and the creator or vendor that you're pulling this font from. So let's say you go to Creative Market and you see a font that you really like. You go, you click, you download, and before you purchase, you see that there are these different licenses that you can purchase. These licenses will include things like can be used commercially, how many pieces that this font can be used in, not being able to alter the font, these sorts of things. So it's really a guideline of what you can and cannot do with this font. And just legally, it's best to go ahead. If you think you're going to use it commercially, just go ahead and buy the commercial license. If you don't do commercial work and you're really only doing things for fun and it's something personal use is fine. But if you're going to toe that line, I would go ahead and err on the side of caution and go ahead and support the artist for creating that font or support the group for providing that font and purchase a license.
And I think, in my opinion, the fonts that come preloaded with whatever design applications or word processing applications you have, that's your basic palette. In my opinion, I don't think you should go beyond, but I know some people want to get a little more creative. Another question in the chat we have is, if you see a font in someone else's design that you like and you want to use something similar, are there resources or ways to find the name or family of the font digitally? And I have used in the past an app called What the Font, which basically takes your phone camera and allows you to take a picture of a font, and then it will return whatever font it is. But that's been 10 years ago, and I don't know, there might be some other apps out there now. Ashley, what are your thoughts on that?
No, that's great. What the Font is still a wonderful resource. It's basically like reverse image searching for a font. So it's really beneficial if you don't have the name. If you're working with somebody or if I'm trying to think if maybe you have the name, but you're not sure where they got it. Honestly, typing those into DeFont or Font Squirrel, like let's say you know that part of the name is veranda something. If you go into those and type that in, that's a good way to kind of narrow down if that's in those. Sometimes you can even just Google if you know part of the name and just go through some of the options and you'll find it. A lot of that is though, I would do the font first and do some of that reverse image searching to see if you can find it before you really have to dig through any of the other resources.
Okay, thank you. Before we take more questions, I want to take a moment to let you know that my colleague Sarah Schmidt is going to be initiating a poll sometime before we end this session, basically asking you how you found out about this webinar. We want to find out what where you're coming to us from, and how we can effectively communicate and promote these webinars as we go forward through the year and continue this series. So you had mentioned before, Ashley, about converting from RGB to CMYK. Is that a good practice, or should whatever your raw image is that you're taking with your camera, should that be CMYK? Should you go into your camera settings and set it to output at CMYK before you do anything?
Well, I think in this day and age, we're probably using that resource for multiple things. I kind of doubt that anybody's taking a picture just with print in mind. Maybe they want to use that photo and use it on a social media graphic to promote themselves, or maybe they want to include it on an email or something else. I would say go ahead and save it, have it in your camera as RGB, and transferring it over in Photoshop or Illustrator to CMYK is totally fine. That's what we do for our magazine. It will print well. It's just making sure that you go in and take that step so that when that photo is actually printed, it's produced the best way possible in the color space that you want it to be produced in.
Okay. And since you are, oh, and there's the poll. Ashley, you mentioned that you're a photographer, so since you're here, I'm going to ask you this question. I don't know that it necessarily has to do with design, but it certainly makes makes a designer's work a little easier. What are the best kinds of photos to use in a print or digital communications piece that, and bear in mind, we're the audience today is representatives, leaders of arts organizations, or individual artists themselves. What kind of image do you think best helps sell the product of the arts or an individual's artwork?
Gotcha. So when it comes to selling artwork in general, I think a high quality image of the artwork itself is wonderful. When it comes to taking a picture of the artist with the artwork, I would prefer, and I think most consumers prefer, more of a candid approach than a staged approach, especially if you can get photos of the artist doing what they're doing, engaging with their piece, looking at, even if it's hung up on the wall, looking at their piece, interacting with somebody else and talking with somebody about the piece. Those types of images, instead of a staged image, are received better by most demographics.
Mhm. So, getting a candid shot of of the artist in their studio at the potter's wheel or
Right.
at the canvas. Okay.
Mhm.
Um, with organizations, uh, I might add that if you've got an exhibit going up, people looking at the exhibit, photos of the exhibit being installed are also a good one, especially for social media, to let people know what what you're doing, what's coming. This is my newspaper background coming out, but I would avoid anything where you've got people lined up against a wall with a big check or holding on to an object or something like that, because it doesn't really tell a story. All it really does is get people's faces, which are important, but it's more important. I'd rather see what your organization does rather than who is involved in it. Um, uh, so um, I mean, that would be my advice on that. I'm not the expert here, but I'm drawing on my newspaper background too.
No, absolutely. I mean, our demographics, most people are looking for authenticity. And to give them authenticity, we kind of show them a behind the scenes or a one-on-one of something, showing them the face value image of something, a staged photo of you holding something, doesn't really give them that behind the scenes. That gives them the face value. This is it. And most people are looking to dive a little deeper, especially if they're interested in your artwork or interested in you or your brand.
Yeah, and you can tell, I mean, the videos on Facebook that are really popular are artists in their studios doing what they do. So translate that to your photography, and I think you'll have some success. Um, it doesn't look like there are any more questions in the chat, and we're a little early. It looks like we're gonna get done early. So Ashley, thank you for taking your time today and sharing with us your expertise on graphic design and best practices in working with printers. We certainly appreciate it, and we hope everybody is able to take something away from them or away from this into their respective organizations or studios. Since we have a captive audience, I'm going to take this time to have a little commercial for the Kentucky Crafted Market, which is coming up March 9th and 10th at the Kentucky Horse Park's All Tech Arena. It's an assemblage of more than 100 of the best visual and craft artists in Kentucky, all under one roof, including live music, hands-on activities area, and a folk art area. So there's a lot going on, a lot of eye candy and activities going on at the Kentucky Crafted Market. It is absolutely free, so we encourage you to come and visit us March 9th and 10th at the Kentucky Horse Park. In the coming weeks, we'll have an announcement about next month's webinar in the 2024 Creative Industry Summit series. So be on the lookout for that. And once again, thank you for joining us today, and have a wonderful Monday.